NATO was born in 1949. That single founding moment launched what would grow into the most enduring military partnership humanity has ever constructed. For 75 years, that partnership held. Through the grinding decades of the Cold War, through the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union, through the horror of September 11th, through the long, costly engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan, and through Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, 75 years of collective resolve, tested repeatedly and never broken, until today. Because on March 16, 2026, the President of the United States threatened to dismantle the entire structure, not because a Russian missile struck alliance territory, not because China moved against a partner nation. The trigger was something far simpler and far more revealing. The United Kingdom, Germany, France, Japan, and Australia each delivered the same two-letter answer to the most powerful man on Earth: no. Trump had demanded that NATO member nations dispatch their warships to the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow, irreplaceable waterway through which one-fifth of the world's entire oil supply flows on any given day. His argument was straightforward. Countries that depend on Gulf oil should be the ones protecting the routes that carry it. He called the operation small. He said he would remember who helped and who did not. And then, in an interview with the Financial Times, he delivered the sentence that sent shockwaves crashing through every foreign ministry on the planet. He said that any failure to help would prove very bad indeed for the future of NATO. Tonight, we are going to walk through exactly why every major ally refused, and why their reasons cut far deeper into Trump's strategic position than Washington appears willing to acknowledge. We will examine what is happening to oil prices at this very moment and what those numbers mean for the cost of filling your tank this week. We will examine the one country that quietly moved two tankers through that supposedly closed strait while everyone else was still debating, and what that single achievement reveals about who actually holds leverage in this crisis. And we will examine the three words spoken by Germany's government that may represent the most significant statement ever made about NATO in the alliance's entire 75-year existence. Let us begin with Germany. Berlin's response was not a diplomatic hedge. It was not a carefully worded expression of concern paired with a promise to review the situation. Chancellor Friedrich Merz sent a spokesperson directly in front of the cameras to deliver a statement that had never once been made in reply to any NATO request across the full span of the alliance's history. This war, the spokesperson said, has nothing to do with NATO. The German government added that participation in any operations inside the Strait of Hormuz had not been considered before this conflict began and was not being considered now. Germany's own foreign minister, speaking to reporters in Brussels, stated plainly that he sees no role whatsoever for NATO nations in the strait at this time. That is not hesitation. That is not a pause for reflection. That is a door being shut, locked, and bolted from the inside. France matched that position without flinching. The French Armed Forces minister stated that France would maintain a strictly defensive military posture and would not allow itself to be drawn into a war being led jointly by the United States and Israel. The message required no interpretation, not our war, not our coalition, not our sailors to risk. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer was equally direct, declaring that the UK would not be pulled into the wider conflict now taking shape. He announced this while simultaneously releasing a £53 million support package aimed at helping British households absorb the surging cost of heating oil, costs driven upward by the very crisis his closest ally started. Starmer is spending government money to protect British families from the economic damage caused by a war he has chosen not to join. Japan cited its own legal framework, noting that domestic law places strict constraints on overseas military deployments and that operations in the Strait of Hormuz might not satisfy those legal thresholds. Prime Minister Takahashi told Parliament directly that no decision had been made to dispatch escort vessels to the region. Australia stated that it had received no formal request and would not be sending ships regardless. South Korea indicated it was still considering the matter, which, in the practice language of diplomacy, almost always signals a refusal in the making. Iran's Revolutionary Guard naval commander offered his own response to the entire coalition effort with 5 words: let him send ships. But here is the detail that lays bare the full depth of Trump's isolation. The refusal is not simply a matter of traditional allies turning away. The United States Navy itself has been declining near daily requests from commercial shipping companies asking for escorts through the strait. Reuters confirmed that the Navy informed those companies directly that the threat environment in the area was too dangerous to justify involvement. Read that sentence again carefully. Trump is demanding that Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Japan send their sailors into waters that the United States Navy has already decided are too hazardous for American sailors to enter. The operation he described as small and limited is, by his own military's assessment, a shooting gallery, a zone of active danger that America itself has stepped back from entirely. And yet, while every Western nation was locked in argument and refusal, one country said almost nothing publicly and then did something extraordinary. India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar sat down with the Financial Times and disclosed something that stopped analysts in Washington cold. India had already been in direct negotiations with Tehran. Those negotiations had produced concrete results, and 2 Indian-flagged gas tankers had passed safely through the Strait of Hormuz that Saturday, moving through waters supposedly sealed shut, without a single shot fired, without any naval escort, carried through entirely by diplomacy. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi later confirmed on CBS that multiple countries had approached Tehran seeking safe passage for their vessels, and that the final decision on granting that passage rests with the Iranian military. Iran is not running a traditional geographic blockade. It is running a targeted political one. The strait is open to countries outside Washington's orbit. It is closed specifically to the United States and its allies. China has publicly stated that keeping the strait open matters for global trade, while continuing to import Iranian oil through those same waters without apparent disruption. Reports indicate Trump threatened to cancel his planned summit with President Xi Jinping unless Beijing helped resolve the situation. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent remarked that it remained to be seen whether that meeting would proceed. China's foreign ministry responded that the 2 sides remain in communication, which is diplomatic language for, we are watching, we are waiting, and we are in no hurry. Beijing is calculating how long it can remain outside this crisis, while the Western world absorbs every consequence of it, and the consequences are now arriving at the gas pump. Oil reached nearly $115 a barrel this week, the highest level since July 2022. U.S. gas prices have climbed to their highest point since October 2023. Diesel fuel is approaching $5 a gallon across large portions of the country. The International Energy Agency has stated in direct terms that this conflict is producing the largest supply disruption ever recorded in the history of the global oil market. Not the worst in recent years, not the worst since the 1970s embargo, the worst ever measured. Here is why prices keep climbing even after the emergency reserve release. The IEA's 32 member nations agreed to release 400 million barrels of oil from emergency stockpiles, the largest coordinated release in the agency's history. But at the current pace of disruption, 15 million barrels of crude and 5 million barrels of refined products are being cut off from global markets every single day. At that rate, the entire 400 million barrel buffer disappears in 26 days. 26 days. That emergency reserve is a bandage applied to a wound that requires surgery. The surgery means reopening the strait. Reopening the strait requires either a diplomatic agreement with Iran or a military operation that every significant ally on Earth has now refused to support. 1,000 oil tankers are currently stranded and unable to transit the strait, At least 10 vessels have been hit, targeted, or attacked since February 28th. Naval mines have been placed throughout the waterway, according to UK Maritime Trade Operations data. The IRGC has warned that it will destroy any vessel attempting passage without Iranian authorization. EU energy ministers are in emergency session today focused on containing the damage to energy costs. Iran's supreme leader has pledged to keep the strait closed. Senior Iranian officials have warned the world to prepare for the possibility of oil reaching $200 a barrel if the situation escalates further. And resting above all of these numbers, above the stranded tankers and the mines and the climbing prices, sits the single most consequential geopolitical question this crisis has produced. What happens to NATO if nobody answers the call? Article 5, the provision stating that an attack on one member is an attack on all, is the most powerful security guarantee ever written into an international agreement. It is the foundation that kept Western Europe free from major war for 8 decades. It is the reason smaller nations on Russia's borders chose alignment with the West rather than accommodation with Moscow. It is the reason the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, and more than a dozen others built their entire national security strategies around membership in this alliance. The architecture of Western security rests on a single assumption. When America calls, allies answer. When allies are threatened, America responds. That assumption was not shattered today, but it was bent in ways that will take years of sustained effort to straighten. Germany said this is not NATO's war. France said it would not be drawn into this coalition. Japan said its own laws may prohibit involvement. The United Kingdom said it would not be entangled in the wider conflict. And none of those positions are wrong. The Strait of Hormuz is outside NATO territory. The war with Iran did not begin with an attack on a member state. Article 5 does not apply. Every ally that refused today did so on grounds that are both legally defensible and strategically coherent. Trump's response was to threaten the alliance itself. That exchange, that precise dynamic, is what every adversary of the Western world is studying tonight. Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang are all watching carefully to see whether American threats directed at its own allies carry more weight than American threats directed at its actual enemies. Meanwhile, India got 2 tankers through the strait on Saturday using a phone call and a negotiating table. While Washington was issuing ultimatums on social media, New Delhi was producing results on the water. The strait is not closed to the world. It is closed to America and its closest partners, which means the path out of this crisis runs directly through the kind of direct diplomacy with Iran that Washington has so far chosen not to pursue. The country doing that work is not the United States. It is the world's most populous democracy, operating on its own terms, protecting its own interests, and achieving in a single conversation what the most powerful military alliance in history has so far been unable to accomplish through pressure, threats, and ultimatums. Here is where things stand tonight. Oil is at $115 a barrel. Diesel is approaching $5 a gallon. 1,000 tankers sit stranded. The emergency buffer runs out in 26 days. Every major Western ally has said no. America's own Navy has said the waters are too dangerous. And the President of the United States is threatening to dismantle a 75-year alliance that preserved peace across an entire continent, because France and Germany will not send their sailors into waters that American sailors have already been ordered to avoid. The decisions made in the next 72 hours will determine whether this crisis remains manageable or becomes the moment the world order that shaped the last 8 decades finally begins to give way.